part of your series. I think we all probably have some shared interest from the sound of that description for the series. I get to conclude, I guess, the 2024 series with a seasonal topic here, talking about live reads. Just a little bit by way of introduction, my name is Sheri. As Brooklyn said, I serve as the state coordinator for our Georgia Master Gardener Extension Volunteer Program. So I work with some fabulous people all across the state of Georgia. But I also serve as an extension specialist in consumer ornamentals. So that means I work and teach and train a lot about woody plant materials, all, trees and shrubs of all kinds of shapes and sizes. So that's where my fascination lies. I mean, I'm like oriented that way. So when it comes to seasonal decoration, I'm very resourceful, and you're going to hear that in our presentation today. I prefer to use what is out in our landscapes. And in fact, when I moved to a new home a few years ago, there was nothing in the landscape. Well, that's not true. There was a lot of overgrown stuff in the landscape, which immediately came out. But I was replanting with that goal of having materials in the garden and landscape to use for decoration purposes. And today we're going to talk specifically about live wreaths. And there's a lot of photos throughout this presentation. They're not my work. For example, the one here, this is from Colonial Williamsburg. I was there a couple of years ago in the holiday season, and they had some fantastic examples, and we're going to use those for inspiration. I don't pretend to be of Colonial Williamsburg's caliber in terms of their decorating and so forth, but I hope you take away from today's lesson that you can enrich your space, your setting, using some pretty basic materials, some simple techniques, and you can get a lot of enjoyment out of it. So we're going to talk about live reads, and we're going to cover three main points today. We're going to talk about materials, we're going to talk about the process of creating that wreath, and then how you care for it through the holiday season. And as Brooklyn said, if you've got questions at any time, feel free to drop them into the chat box. I've got that pulled up in front of me, and I'm happy to answer those as we go along if I can, or we can wait until the end either way. But to be clear, when I say live wreaths, I'm talking about a wreath that is made with fresh greenery. So we're not talking about a plastic foliage base or plastic flowers, anything artificial. And the base itself, the form could be dried, but the greenery that goes on it is generally live. So you can add a few dried options, and in fact, I'm going to show that to you. But when I say live wreaths, I'm referring to that fresh greenery that's going to go around the wreath form and provide our base for our wreath arrangement. And as I said a few minutes ago, I am such an advocate of using what you have. In fact, the example I'm going to show you here in a few minutes, I made completely with stuff I had on hand. I did not go out and buy anything new. And that's because I've done this before. I did have some supplies already on hand. So once you do this the first time, you invest in your tools, it can be something that you can do over and over again. So I really find value in that, and a lot of other folks do as well. So again, look around your garden and your landscape. There's no need to go out and purchase things. Reuse supplies from year to year. You might have bows that still have life in them. You can store them kind of fluffed up, and you can use that from year to year. If you look in this arrangement, it's not a wreath, but in this photo here, these are pieces that we use from year to year. And add fresh things in here. But these pieces of wood here have actually been used. We've used a hole saw to cut a slot in there for a votive candle. So I don't know if you can see that, but there in the center, there's that indentation to drop in some votive candles. And those are just simple pieces of tree limbs that have been cut and used. And we also use these lotus pods from year to year. And I don't have it built into the slides, but along the way, you're going to see some sparkly silver and some sparkly gold, and spray paint is everyone's friend. So just put that in your little toolbox, your little mental toolbox, that some spray paint can go a long way, whether it's on lotus pods, or I've even painted pine cones. We will talk about pine cones here in a minute. And I have also painted hydrangea blossoms, which are up here in their natural form. But again, in this picture, What I'm showing you are things like lotus pods and those wooden candle holders that I'm going to hold on to from year to year. I don't always have access to lotus pods. They're pretty special and they'll last quite a long time if stored in some cool and dry locations. Okay, so again, use what you have, be resourceful. And that leads right into our conversation about materials. How do I go about making a live wreath? What do I have to have on hand? All right, so first of all, some very basic tools and supplies. You're going to be harvesting and collecting greenery. You're going to need some cutting tools. So our photo on the right, I used some loppers, and then I had two different pairs of pruning shears. The Felcos here on the bottom left cut larger pieces, up to about a half an inch maybe. The finer needle-nosed pruners, things pencil size and smaller in diameter. But again, we'll work with both sizes. And of course, the loppers I used when I went out and collected the larger branches. Over in the photo on the left, paddle wire. This is florist wire. I chose it on a paddle. You can get it in long pieces and sticks. You can get it in different gauges, which is their thickness and their strength. For wreath assembly, I really prefer the paddle wire. It's very thin, very easy to work with, and because it's on that paddle, you can just be wrapping it around your wreath forms and your greenery and such, and be working with it without it spooling out on you. So that's very handy. And then, of course, these little pliers are metal snips, and so they will trim that wire. I also had a bow and some pipe cleaners. I didn't show that here in the tools and supplies, but these little snips will also clip and trim those pipe cleaners that I use for making and fastening my bow to the wreath at the end. And again, you'll get to see that in just a second. Some additional supplies that you're going to need is going to be your wreath form. So what you're going to use to make your wreath. And I've got a bunch of different examples here. There are pros and cons to both, and there are ways to make these free of charge if you have access to the materials. So first, the two of my least favorites for wreath forms. The upper corner here, this is a styrofoam wreath base. I do have an example about midway through our presentation here that I'll show you where this actually was the preferred base for the materials we were working with. But this is not Oasis foam. It's not hydrated. It is styrofoam. And so literally it's good for just sticking things into and anchoring it to that. But hot glue will melt it. It can become brittle and break. So if it falls off your front door or your gate or whatever, it could break and ruin your wreath. But if that's what you have, that's what you have. So there's the styrofoam. The second one is over here on the right. These are straw wreath forms. And I have seen crafters use the straw wreath forms for their live wreaths. Again, it's a base. We're going to cover it up. It's just giving you that circle to work from. If you've got a straw wreath already and you want to use it, help yourself. But it's again not my favorite. It's more bulky. It takes a little bit more to cover it up. So again, it's just not my preference. I think of that more as an October, November type of wreath where I'm going to put some more fall colored things on it, and it would be appropriate for the straw base, to be visible. So again, if you've got it and that's what you're working with, work it, use it by all means. The third option here in the bottom center is a wire wreath base, and you can get these in various diameters. I happen to have a bunch of these left over from a former adventure in my life when I actually had a retail nursery and garden center and would sell this type of stuff and make these sorts of things. So I had some, and I pull them out every year and reuse them and put them back in my storage boxes when I'm done. So they hold up a long, long time. They're not expensive. I'm embarrassed to say I found a price tag on this one. It's so many years old that it only cost me 50 cents. At a retail price today, if you were to purchase them from like Hobby Lobby, some other craft store, it would cost you $3 or $4. They're not terribly expensive. And again, once you buy them, you can use them for a long period of time. And you can use them for other seasons. And then finally, over here on the left, this is your grapevine form. And many folks are very skilled at harvesting their own wild grapevines and fashioning them into wreath forms and using that for their wreaths. And that is perfectly fine. And so that's an example of using what you have and it not costing you anything other than a little investment in time to go harvest those grapevines and wrap them up and shape that base. That can be a lot of fun and an adventure in itself. So again, we're starting with our wreath making activities. We've got our tools handy. We've got our supplies, our paddle wire and so forth. Now we've chosen our wreath form so that we can get guides the shape of the wreath. And now the next step, this is probably the most fun, I think, being a horticulturalist. The next step is to choose what we're going to put on this wreath. So we get to talk about plants. And generally, when we put together a wreath like this, a live wreath, we're looking for a lot of evergreen foliage to cover that form. And then we want to accent it. We might want to look for some foliage that has some different colors, maybe some different textures. So give us some visual contrasts. We're going to talk about plants that offer berries and blooms, as well as cones and pods that will act as accents and decorations. So all of that's going to be very pleasing, and you get creative license, whatever works for you. If it coordinates with your door color or your fence color or the event that you're putting the wreath for together for to celebrate, whatever, it's your preference, your deal. I will say this third bullet here, not all plant materials are going to hold up for long periods of time or in whatever weather conditions we have. Sometimes Decembers can be quite warm. Right now it's chilly, but our preceding weeks have been quite warm for a long length of time. And so all of that is going to decrease the lifespan of the decorations, the plant materials that we collect and make these wreaths out of. But we will talk about care as our last bit of conversation today. So not all plant materials are going to hold up forever. So it might be nice to be able to pull them out quickly and insert something new and fresh in there, spruce it up. And this last disclaimer here, we're going to talk about this a couple of times this afternoon. Berries will drop off of their stalks. So we can put these nice clusters of berries into our wreaths. They're beautiful, they're eye-catching, they're pretty color, but they will dry up and drop off. And that becomes a concern if we've got small children that are at that stage, they're putting things in their mouth. Maybe we have older adults living with us that aren't quite aware maybe of all the things that they're doing. So they might be inclined to pick up something and put it in their mouth, and or pets. So if you've got, any of those special people and pets in your life, just be cognizant of that and maybe choose some different pieces, or maybe this wreath is going in a location where it doesn't matter. So just be cognizant of that. And again, I'll mention a couple of examples as we go along. All right, so let's take a look at this. Hey, Brooklyn, I don't know if you have that handout that you can drop into the chat box and share with everybody, but if they want to, or if you follow up with them, I don't know. But I do have a handout that lists the plant materials that I'm getting ready to share. So maybe she can send that to you when we're done. So when we think about live wreaths, and that greenery, that base foundation, my first and foremost favorite is this right here, this Fraser fir. I moved here from Virginia. I'm used to choose and cut Fraser firs. They don't like our southeastern climate down here, so I have to go purchase it. And so when I purchase a holiday tree, I save those lower limbs off of the tree, and that becomes my wreath. That becomes my living wreath. So that picture right there was taken just this week. Those are that's just a few of the pieces. And I had just the perfect amount. What I took off of my tree, the bottom of my tree, to get it to fit in my tree stand was just enough to build the wreath that I'm going to show you. And thank you, Brooklyn. She's posted that handout if you want to open that up real quick, folks. That just will guide you with the plant names that I'm talking about as we go along. So Fraser fir is very fragrant. It's that classic holiday scent. There's several other spruces and such that you can purchase at this time of year for holiday decorating. So you might want to use that as your base. We also encounter boxwood wreaths at this time of year. They tend to be very expensive and kind of a specialty thing. So I tend to save my boxwood as an accent, but if you've got a tremendous number of boxwoods in your garden and you can harvest from them and make a wreath out of that, then by all means, make yourself a very pretty, very attractive boxwood wreath. And then finally, we have a lot of pine, several different species in our gardens and landscapes here in Georgia. So pine may be your material of choice. And you can see this photo here. This is a swag that we made for a previous activity, but it shows you the difference in the needle as compared to the Fraser fir, and certainly different than a boxwood foliage. But any of these would be suitable for greenery to cover up your wreath form. You may have access to some of these materials in your landscape as well. Leyland cypress is a common and popular evergreen hedging material. The plant grows very tall and very fast, so you can often get a hold of a lot of that greenery. And if that's the case, then try your hand at using that on a wreath form. The middle one, Juniperus virginiana, is the eastern red cedar. This is a native plant for us. The photo that I'm showing you there has a very heavy cone set. Those are actually cones that are covered. They look like this blue waxy type of berry, but it's actually the cone, and they are gorgeous when they've got that heavy cone set on them. And so the foliage is fragrant, and you've got that as well. So that can be a nice, inexpensive, and easily accessible green for you. And then I also included our Magnolia grandiflora. So this is our big native it's a large tree. I'll get it right here in a second. It is a native tree. And it has those large waxy leaves to them, and it gets the fragrant bloom in the summertime that smells like a perfume, really. So I'm going to show you an example where we use magnolia leaves as the entire leaf, as the entire greenery on the leaf, but I'm also going to show you examples of where Magnolia grandiflora has been used as an accent. And speaking of accent, as we put together our wreath, as we get that bottom layer established, that base green color put into place, now we get to start decorating it, and we are looking for some things that are going to provide us interest, accent. So again, looking around our garden, akuba, Japanese akuba, up here in the upper corner of our screen here. Variegated foliage. This is a shade-loving shrub. It looks beautiful against an evergreen wreath. So that's a nice foliage. It also works well as a cut flower. Maybe you've got a Rheingold arborvitae in your landscape. This is the left-hand side. Rheingold arborvitae were pretty popular in the late 80s, early 90s. They're not seen so much on the retail scene anymore. But if you've got them, they are attractive and can be a perfect accent foliage for you. Another one that's less common, you're certainly not going to find this, in a bin of holiday greens for sale, but I have this planted in my landscape, and I am a huge fan of Chamaecyparis obtusa cripsi. This is a gold fern spray fall cypress, and I love the grace of that foliage and its gold color, and that contrasts nicely with green. So I'll show you what that looks like on a wreath form. I'm famous for snipping some of that and including that in my greenery decorations. Again, it's a specialty plant. It's not like you're going to have a great long hedge of it. So you have to use it as an accent. You have to use it sparingly. And you also, when pruning and snipping off pieces of plants like thuya and Chamaecyparis and pine and so forth, you got to be careful not to prune past their active growth points, or you'll end up with a stub. The evergreens just won't, those conifers just won't regenerate. All right, on the screen here, I've got all kinds of stuff. If you were in one of my woody plant materials courses, I would have a quiz for you and say which one of these is holly and which one of these is not. They look very, very, very much all like holly, but they are pretty much half and half. Some of them are hollies and some of them are osmanthus or false holly, and sometimes known as tea olive. But regardless, they all have beautiful leaves. Some of them are variegated, so we get that as an interest. And then some of them produce berries that give us further accent and decoration. So up here in the upper right, that's a Mary Nell holly, so a beautiful red leaf set there. In the top row middle, this is an osmanthus, so false holly. The photo on the upper left is a variegated holly, and as is the photo on the bottom left. That's a variegated Chinese holly, very slow growing. The photo in the middle is also a holly, and the photo on the bottom right is an osmanthus. That is a cultivar called Goshiki. A very, very spiny, but a very nice variegated foliage. So those are fun to include in your decorations, your decor. And if you want another sort of accent foliage, consider something with fragrance. Maybe you're in a situation where you can use some rosemary or some southern wax myrtle to get that classic bayberry scent. So maybe your wreath might be in a place where you want to add a little fragrance. So choosing a couple of accent greens for that might suit your fancy as well. All right, so we've got the basic green to cover our wreath form. We've chosen some accent foliage. We've looked around and seen what could be pretty interesting. And I should have also said, those accent foliages are very different in terms of their texture, their leaf shape and their texture. Some are very fine leaf, some are very bold leaf. So all of that creates visual interest as you're composing this live wreath. And so then we start looking around in our gardens and landscapes for things with blooms. So this time of year, you probably have some camellias that are starting to bloom. We had all these freezing temperatures this week, so a lot of stuff that was holding out from our summer gardens, that's all gone. It's all toast now. But you've got a lot of stuff that was blooming and is like in its dried stage. So these photos are a little bit they are the equivalent of being taken a few weeks ago. Our stuff in the garden right now is looking more dry. So I mentioned earlier hydrangea blossoms. This one on the left, that is a hydrangea. If you are forward thinking, if you are a forward thinking planner for your holiday decor, you may wish to harvest your hydrangea blossoms in the summer and hang them to dry so that they retain some of their natural color. Or if you're more like me and you're more improvisational, you're going to go out into the landscape right now. Your hydrangeas probably have a papery look to them, and that's just fine too. I'll show you what that will look like when we put it all together. Look around for some grasses, some ornamental grasses. This one is the pink muhly grass. It's very, very fine. It has a tendency to fall apart and actually blow. I'm finding wisps of muhly grass all over my garden. Not in a terrible way, but just in a natural. It's just what it does. But there's all different kinds of grasses that you'll be able to harvest in their dried state and use that as a vertical interest. And then I just use this as an example. These are abelia flowers. And when abelia is spent in those, if you've got a very floriferous cultivar like this one, this is Raspberry Profusion that was developed by Dr. Carol Robacker here on the UGA Griffin campus. Once their bloom part is done, they have a lot of color and texture resulting from the sepals that remain. And so even in a post-frost state like we're in now, they will still have a lot of visual appeal, and you may want to use that when you put your wreath together. So there's blooms. Then there are berries, and I've mentioned a couple of times that berries can add a lot of visual interest. The photo on the left is our American bittersweet, so you could harvest some of those berries to decorate with. We don't like the Chinese bittersweet because it is invasive. It will be very problematic in the garden, but the Celastris scandens, the golden berried one, is native. The photo in the middle is our winterberry holly. So right now their leaves are still on them. They're deciduous, so they drop their leaves and the berries then become the focus, like is in that middle photo. Um, Right now, your stems of winterberry may have some gold leaves. They may still be yellow, still may be shedding again because we've had such a late fall, late frost. So if you chose winterberry, you might have to pluck their leaves off at this point in time. And then again, there's another photo of that Mary Nell um, holly. And there are lots of hollies. I'm not exclusively promoting Mary Nell. It's just one I had a nice photo of, but there are lots and lots of holly species and cultivars that are very productive in terms of berries and will be very attractive. And they're varying degrees of spininess and pokiness. But with this conversation of berries, as I mentioned before, not all berries are going to hold up the same. This is a Calicarpa, I think that's right, that I have in my garden at home. It's a variegated form and it comes with white berries. And um, I want to use it all the time. I try to press the foliage. I try to harvest those berries for crafts and things because I like the way they're on the stems. And I get very annoyed every single time because they shatter very quickly. So not useful for crafts. I just leave it in the garden. You can see I have it crumbled into my hand there. So not all berries are going to hold up very well in our arrangements in like live wreaths and such especially as they dry out. So just take that word of caution. Again, I reminded you earlier of your people and your pets, um, being aware of who's around you and who might have access to these berries as they drop off. That could be problematic, both from a choking hazard and maybe from a toxicity or a reaction kind of concern. All right. Some additional inspiration from our gardens for our wreaths include fruits and cones and pods. I have some unusual things here on the screen. On the left, there's some more of that spray paint in action. Anybody know what this is right here in the middle of the screen? I've circled it. Almost grab a drink of water while you maybe drop into the chat box your guess. Anybody know? Yes, Brooklyn got it. Cheryl got it. Excellent. It is indeed okra. So you got to, again, be forward thinking about that. Dry your pods, leave them on the plants long enough for them to begin drying and harvest them, let them finish drying. And then I used some silver spray paint. In this case, I've painted them gold. You can leave them natural. You can make them red, whatever you want to do. But okra pods are fantastic craft materials. I've done all kinds of things with them. That they can be great additions to our wreaths. Here's some more of those lotus pods. Here are some natural hydrangeas. Here are some silver painted hydrangeas. In the upper right hand, oh, I forgot we've got some gold okra pods and we've got some gold pine cones here. Here are my spray paint cans if you must know. Over here on the upper right hand corner, those are some rose hips. Again, if you're being resourceful with your landscape materials and so forth, maybe you've got some rose hips. If you grow Rosa rugosa, goodness, they have gorgeous, gorgeous rose hips and great color. So you might want to grab those and use them in your wreath. Anybody know what this softball looking thing is in the bottom right hand corner? It's kind of a piece of trivia there. It's kind of an old-fashioned plant. It is native. Um, it's what we call Osage orange or hedge apple. And those things literally are like softballs. Found this one planted in Washington, D.C., right a block or two from the Capitol. They have a gorgeous color. And if you are creative in terms of your wiring, getting a wire through that, you can anchor it. I'm going to show you how it's been used in a wreath. Got a picture here in a minute. So they are just a really attractive color. And if you don't feel like putting it on your wreath and you want to still use it in your decor, you can certainly nestle it in table arrangements and things like that. So it's a really fun, different sort of color. All right, so hopefully you got some inspiration there. Cheryl's inspired to use okra pods in her wreath, so that sounds fun. So again, here are some more pictures from my trip to Williamsburg. They are fantastic with their decor. The photo on the left is a combination of apples and pomegranates. So you'll see on your handout, one of the ideas there is fruits. I think this might be a spray of that Eastern red cedar, the Juniperus virginiana, or I think that's what they had in there. And you will see some shells, the use of shells in several of their pictures, but there's also some photos of milkweed pods and um, any sort of pod. And I can't tell you exactly what this is, but in this wreath on the right, there are some pods. You can see that Fraser fir base is, very prominent in both of them. In the picture on the right, they've used like a Granny Smith apple, and right here, front and center, y'all, as their focal point, they have one of those Osage oranges. And then these are pine cones from white pine, so Pinus strobus. And I don't know what they're using for those white flowers, but those are some dried flowers of sorts. So you can see how they have chosen four groupings around that wreath form. You got to choose your diameter for your door, and so I didn't really get into sizes and so forth. And some of these examples are smaller, and some of them are larger. The photo on the left, again, we've got some pomegranates, we've got some artichokes, and that gray color is love in a mist. So Nigella, we can actually grow that as an annual here, and you can harvest it. Though I don't tend to have as great a result creating those pods, achieving those pods as they've shown there. And of course, they have some wheat blossoms and some more oyster shells in there. Again, Williamsburg and its proximity to the water. Why do I keep saying okra? Oyster shells. They are a resource that they have, and of course, was part of colonial living. So they have featured that very creatively on that wreath. So in this case, if you look closely, there is some moss, like some Spanish moss type of stuff on, kind of covering the base, and you can really see it in there. So this is a situation where the materials might really support using one of those straw bases that it would, disappear on you, just kind of recede into the arrangement. And the wreath on the right, you can see that the grapevine wreath, let's see, I'm working off two screens here. The grapevine wreath here, you can see it. It kind of peeks out between those materials. We have some dried apple slices. We have some apple fruits. We have some lovely dried flowers. Do you see that in the arrangement there? A lot of that is celosia and straw flower. And they've also added in some like toys, like some handmade dolls and things like that. So they've gotten very clever. Not sure exactly what they're using that's hemlock. They've used hemlock as their base, as their greenery. So we don't have, hemlocks are native to this area, but we don't see them as much. They're not as prominent down here. But they are lovely. And those little cones, those little hemlock cones, I love them. I do. Again, I'm from Virginia, so all of this just resonates strongly with me. So these are some local examples. The wreath on the left was actually hanging at Hills and Dales Estate in LaGrange. And in that wreath, there's a combination of your Fraser fir as the base. That they've got some of the Eastern red cedar, it looks like, or maybe some other cedar there. They have used magnolia leaves and they've clustered them. So it's almost in lieu of like a flower. It suggests a flower, but it's actually leaves, and they've clustered them around the wreath here. So they've used that repetition. And then we've got some sort of red berry, and I'm not sure exactly what they've chosen for that red berry, but that's how they've accented. And note that the wreath bow, they've put the bow at the top. Now, the example on the right is one we did here. Remember that styrofoam form that I showed you very early on? This is a case where we use the styrofoam base. And we pulled all of these magnolia leaves off of the tree and actually inserted their stem in a metal pick, bent the pick with pliers around that leaf, around the petiole of the leaf, and then inserted that metal pick into the styrofoam wreath form. And we just kept working it out in circles, and some of those leaves, the ones towards the center of the wreath, are almost standing up, whereas the leaves on the outside of the wreath are laying flat. So that's a great resource that lasted a long time. We had them hung in our interior doorway, so kind of like a breezeway. It's not heated, but it's not outside either. And they stayed green for a long, long time, and we did not choose to treat them. I'm going to talk about treating your foliage here at the end when we get into care of our wreaths. But they did, those magnolia leaves stayed green for a long, long time. And even when they faded to brown, the wreath had still a tremendous amount of appeal. And note that we chose to put our bow on the lower center. So again, some different options for you, whatever works for you. All right, so those are some different arrangements, some different looks for your wreath, and some different materials that you can use and choose from your landscape to make your wreath with. So let's talk about the process, how we actually put it together. So you've got to get all those tools and supplies that we talked about earlier, make the choice about your base and your plant materials, get your tools, make sure you have all of those handy and you're ready to go. And remember that fresh is best. So don't harvest this stuff this weekend and then wait until next weekend to make it. You want to make the wreath as soon as you can after harvest. If there's going to be a day or two in between, keep those greens cool and hydrated. You can soak them in like a plastic storage bin or a kiddie pool, anything that you can fill with water, and you can soak those materials. If you choose to go purchase a wreath base that's already covered in Fraser fir or something like that, you can also soak that. Soaking it rinses off a lot of dust and dirt that ends up accumulating on the foliage, but it also hydrates all those cut stems. So you can do that for up to 24 hours before you start arranging. So here we go. Just an example of how I gathered everything that I needed. That photo on the right, literally, it took me, I don't know, less than 10 minutes to go snip, 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 walk around my yard and gather some things. And of course, I had this pile of branches that I had removed from the base of a Fraser fir Christmas tree. So we start putting it together, get all that stuff together. I'm going to go through the next 6 photos kind of in order. So starting left to right, I had my wreath form, which is the wire form, and I was working with Fraser fir as my greenery. So the first thing I did was to use my hand pruners to cut the pieces in, off of the main branches, but I wanted them, I'm thinking bundles, and I wanted those bundles to be in 6 to 9 inches in length. All right, so I cut off the greenish, luscious parts of those tree branches and then began bundling them, assembling bundles. And you can see in the middle photo, once I gathered, a bundle, and sometimes it was 3 stems, sometimes it was 6, just whatever looked like a good bundle that was going to cover the diameter of my metal frame. I then used my paddle wire to secure them together, to bundle them at the base of those things. And then I laid those bundles on top of each other in that wreath form. And the wire wreath form is actually concave. So it's almost like a little groove, a little trough that you can set those bundles in. And you'd be surprised at how naturally this stuff comes together, how this stuff just fits together. So again, whatever your greenery is, the recommendation is to cut it into 6 to 9 inch length pieces and then bundle several of those together and then lay that along your wreath form and wrap it to the wreath form with your paddle wire. And you do this until the wreath form is totally covered. So the photo on the far left here is my wreath form when I finished. And what kept bugging me at this stage was I had some wild hairs. You know, you wake up and your hair's sticking out in the wrong direction. Well, that's what I kept thinking every time I looked at this wreath. But I didn't worry about it. Even though they kept distracting me, I didn't worry about it because I knew in the end it was all going to work out, and I'll show you. And I ended up, when I finished it, I did end up snipping just one of those pieces off, but the rest of them worked in. So what I'm doing in the middle piece is, middle picture here, is I'm beginning to lay out my foliage. If you look closely, that is some of that Chamaecyparis cryptside, the gold fern spray that I'm using as my accent. And it's a little bit different texture and certainly a different color than the green leaf base. So I lay everything out first so that I position it. And what I realized, the picture on the right, I was using my hydrangea blossoms, and those are right off the plant, just that dry, papery look to it, no spray paint. This is a very natural wreath. What I realized was that I'd put all this stuff together and I didn't leave enough space for my bow. So this is why you want to lay it out first. And then once you are happy with everything, use your paddle wire once again to wrap it and secure all of those pieces to your wreath. Now, you ready to see the final result? Here it is, plain and center, front and center, right on my front door. There's my bow. Again, I just made that. I'm no professional bow maker, y'all. So just go with it. Make it work for whatever meets your needs. You can see that I do love the hydrangea. So I have the hydrangea pieces, and I had three hydrangea blossoms up at the top, and I had 4 or 5 of them down at the bottom. I had pieces of the Chinese holly with its heavy berry set, and then I had the gold foliage of the Chamaecyparis as that background. You can see that I made mine an offset. I wanted my bow on the side. You could make it to where it's on the top. You could make it on the bottom. You can do whatever you want to. But again, that's what it ended up being. And once again, I didn't pay anything for anything in this wreath because it was all part of my basic supply. So if you've got that kind of stuff on hand, then you won't have to go and purchase anything extra. And I'd already paid for the Fraser fir greenery as that I used as my base. That was just basically discard from my holiday tree. So it can be very beautiful and yet very economical. And I forget, I was in Costco over the Thanksgiving holiday, and they were selling fully decorated live wreaths, and I don't remember what they cost, maybe $30, I'm not sure. So for just a little bit of time and a lot of fun. And it was very interesting because as I was working on this, I was enjoying myself so much. I've cleaned up and I went to the office, and my mind was just full of things, and I rapid fired one of my coworkers because just as I was working on this, I was very, relaxed, and things were just kind of consolidating in my mind. And so that just tends to happen when we're working out in the garden with our plants. All right, so let's wrap up our discussion of live wreaths with some care tips. Just want to remind you again that we're not working with plastic. Most of the stuff on here is not going to be dried. We're talking about greenery and pieces of plants that have been clipped off of their base plant, their mother plant. So they no longer have roots that are in soil that are taking up water. So these are fresh materials, and they have a lifespan. And so if we can keep them in ideal conditions, they're going to last longer for us. So that is outside where it's cool. Hopefully it's cool, preferably in the shade. We want to avoid bright direct sunlight or reflected heat. Now, that being said, that wreath that I showed you on my front door is in a southwesterly exposure and gets a lot of reflected heat. So it is only going to last about 2 weeks in that location if I leave it there. Some ways to keep it fresh would be to soak it. If you can take it off of your door or your fence or whatever and lay it. I like to use a large plant saucer, one of those really large and 2 to 3 inch deep plant saucers. Fill it with water, take my wreath off the door, and set it in that large saucer. It's a great way to soak it in some water just to kind of revive it a little bit. You can also spritz your greenery, your live greenery with water, but that gets, droplets and everything all over your door and you feel compelled to go and clean it or, it just makes a mess. So I really prefer the soaking if that's an option for you. And then if you've got a big event coming up, and you're trying to prepare decorations for that, some sort of signature holiday celebration or whatever, consider refrigeration if you've got spare refrigerator space to keep your greens cool. I think that's probably a little bit of a stretch for most people, but certainly keeping your greens cool. And Cheryl, I'm gonna come back to your post there in the comments in just a second. Another tip, you might see some anti-desiccant products on the market. You might see those available in the store and wonder if you should buy them. They are optional. It's a waxy type of coating that can help extend the life of your wreath and your greens a little bit. So basically, that waxy solution coats your leaves, and so it reduces water loss. So you first soak your greenery in plain water so that it hydrates and sucks up as much plain water as possible. And then you spray it with an anti-desiccant. Most of them come in little hand trigger bottles. Or you can buy a concentrate, mix that up in a large tub, and then put everything in there and soak it. Yeah, I worked at a nursery when I was in high school, and we would do that to all of our greens before we sold them at holiday time. So I still remember vividly the smell of that stuff. So, like I said, you might get a little bit of extension of life out of it by using it, but most of the time, I mean, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. I don't use it. That's more of a personal recommendation, not a scientific recommendation. Also, you might see some information about preserving your plants in glycerin or soaking them in glycerin. What that does is it makes your foliage more pliable and it lasts a long, long time, but it does lose the natural color. Everything goes to brown. So I'm not real crazy about this. A colleague, Jim Dale Prince at Mississippi State University, has a great publication about this that you can get online if you're interested in it. And that's some of his work there on the right-hand side in that photo. But maybe that's for you. Maybe you like the thought of that, and that is perfectly okay. All right, so I wanted to go back to Cheryl's comments in the chat box. Let's see. You've got a beautiful wreath there. You've made your wreath completely out of pine cones. Way to go, Cheryl. Very, very nice. And you opted to spray paint some of them. Is that right? Is that what I'm seeing? And it looks like you added in maybe some red berries, or, if you had dried celosia flowers from your summer garden or something like that, would be very pretty. Well done. Well done. Very nice. And thank you for sharing. And see, she's used pine cones, which I'm assuming you've got access to. I'm assuming you've got pine trees on your property or somebody close to you. You've had access to those. So the pine cones I consider to be free. A little bit of spray paint, and that is going to last you a long, long time. In fact, with if you the berries won't last this long, but if you continuously add some red to that wreath, you can stretch it right on into Valentine's Day. So very clever for you. Way to go. All right. So we're coming to the end of the presentation here. I'll wrap up with a summary. In creating live wreaths, we've talked about a number of different plant materials that we can use right out of our own landscapes and gardens. We went through some simple steps at how to put it together. It's really quite easy. I don't consider myself a floral designer, and yet I felt like I could put together a pretty decent wreath there. Not a lot of time invested, not a lot of special tools or supplies or anything like that. And then just really easy to take care of. And I will say that when I hung my wreath on the door the first time, I had a couple of pieces up here at the top that flopped over. So I had to take it down and rewire those, and you can't tell it. So, I mean, if you get upright on it, if you come to my door and you knock on the door or ring the doorbell and you're staring at my wreath, you might see some of the mechanics, some of that paddle wire. But for the most part, we're not going to see it. So I'm going to enjoy this for a long, long time. I will probably actually move it to my back door because the exposure will allow it to last a lot longer. I sure do enjoy it there. It's quite pretty. So there you have it. And I'll be happy to take any questions from you. If you want to unmute yourself or if you want to drop them into the chat box, either way, happy to answer some questions.